You just made the
You
biggest
can't park a
mistake of your
camper in the
life calling the
driveway.
cops
It's
on
against the
someone you don't
bylaws.
Actually, I
understand.
checked. It's
The
perfectly
red and
fine
blue
until
lights hit
Thursday.
my
I
windows
have the
before
permit
the
right
knock
here.
ever came, flickering across the hardwood floors like a warning I'd already seen coming hours ago. I didn't move fast, didn't panic,
Lawn
just
is
stood there for a
overgrown, needs
second,
edging.
feeling the low hum of the
Mailbox
neighborhood
peeling,
outside,
paint is a
the kind of
violation.
quiet that only
Hedges are
breaks
too
when something's
high.
about to go very
You
wrong.
are in
Then came
violation
the
of the
pounding,
order. You
sharp,
must stop
confident,
immediately.
like they already
You
knew
can't
how
be
this would end.
serious.
I opened the door to two officers standing on
All
my
right,
porch,
I hear you.
hands
The
resting
plans for
near
the
their
new gazebo
belts,
are off.
posture calm
She's
but
crumbling.
alert.
I told you they'd
Behind them,
listen.
framed
Just give me a minute
perfectly
to
under the
process
streetlight,
this.
was Margaret Whitmore,
Everything is in
arms
order
crossed,
now. We
chin
can
lifted,
finally
that
relax.
tight little smile she wore like a badge of authority. Even from 20 feet away, I could almost smell her perfume mixing with the fresh-cut grass and concrete dust in the air. "That's him," she said, pointing straight at me like she'd been rehearsing it. "He's trespassing. He doesn't belong in this HOA." The officer closest to me glanced down at his notepad, then back at me. "Sir, we got a call about a residency issue. Mind explaining what's going on?" I leaned against the doorframe, slow and steady, like this was just another Tuesday. Because to me it was. "There's nothing going on," I said. "I live here." Margaret let out a short laugh behind them, sharp enough to cut glass. "No, you don't," she snapped. "Everyone in this community is registered with the HOA. We know exactly who belongs here. And he's not on the list." The word list hung in the air like it meant something, like it gave her power. I looked past the officers at her, really looked this time. Perfect posture, immaculate outfit. That same expression I'd seen the day she first walked up to me, clipboard in hand, explaining rules I never agreed to follow. "Ma'am," the second officer said, trying to keep things neutral, "we'll handle it from here." But she didn't back down. Of course she didn't. People like Margaret never do. "He told me himself," she continued, voice rising just enough to carry. "He said he's not part of this HOA. That means he has no right to be here." I felt the corner of my mouth almost move. "Almost." "That's correct," I said. The officers exchanged a quick look. Confusion. Just a flicker, but it was there. "So you're saying you don't belong to the HOA?" one of them asked. I nodded once. Calm. Certain. "That's exactly what I'm saying." Behind them, Margaret's smile widened, like she'd just won something. Like the story was already over in her head. The night air felt still, heavy, waiting. And I could tell, none of them understood what was really happening here. Not yet. The officer shifted his weight slightly, pen hovering over his notebook like he was waiting for the part where this all made sense. I could hear a sprinkler system somewhere down the block clicking on, that steady rhythmic hiss cutting through the silence like background static. Margaret stepped closer now, heels tapping against the pavement, controlled but impatient, like she had already decided how this story should end. "You see," she said, gesturing toward the houses behind her, perfectly aligned lawns stretching under the streetlights. "This is a private community. Every homeowner here agreed to the covenants. Everyone is registered. There are rules." She said rules like it was something sacred. I glanced past her for a second, taking in the identical mailboxes, the uniform fences, the kind of place where everything looked perfect until you looked a little closer. "I understand," I said calmly. "But those rules do not apply to me." That did it. Her smile snapped just a little, the edges tightening as her fingers curled around that clipboard she always carried. "That is not how this works," she replied, voice dropping into something colder, sharper. "If you live here, you follow the HOA. That is the agreement." One of the officers cleared his throat, trying to keep things grounded. "Sir, do you have any documentation showing you reside at this address?" he asked. I nodded once, slow, deliberate. "I do." I could feel Margaret watching me now, eyes locked in, waiting for the moment I slipped, the moment this turned in her favor. The faint buzz of a passing car rolled down the main road behind the subdivision, headlights briefly, sweeping across all of us before disappearing again. The night settled back in. Still, expectant. I reached into my jacket, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. The paper inside felt exactly where I left it earlier, edges crisp, weight familiar. I had read it more times than I could count, memorized every line, not because I needed to, but because I knew tonight would come. Margaret let out a small, almost amused breath. "Oh, this should be good," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let me guess. A lease? A handwritten note?" Something you printed off the internet. The officer's eyes followed my hand as I slowly pulled the folder free, thick, organized, the kind of paperwork that did not come from guesswork or desperation. The kind that came from planning. Ma'am, the officer said again, more firmly this time. Let us just see what he has. But Margaret was not listening anymore. She was already shaking her head, already convinced. It does not matter what he shows you, she insisted. He admitted he is not part of the HOA. That means he has no legal standing here. I looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time that night, I let a small piece of the truth surface in my expression. Not enough to explain, just enough to signal that she had missed something important. Something big. You are right about one thing, I said quietly. I am not part of your HOA. I paused, just long enough for the words to settle, for the silence to stretch tight between us. Then I flipped open the folder, the pages inside catching the porch light as I turned them toward the officer. But that is not the problem here. The officer took the folder from my hand, his fingers brushing the edge of the top page as his eyes dropped down to read, and I watched the exact moment his posture changed, just slightly, like something no longer fit the story he had been told. The porch light reflected off the paper, clean white against the dark, and for a second all you could hear was that sprinkler still ticking in the distance and the faint rustle of leaves along the curb. Sir, he said slowly, scanning the document. This shows ownership transfer. His voice trailed off, eyes narrowing as he flipped to the next page, then the next. Margaret stepped forward immediately, her heels clicking faster now, the confidence still there but thinner, stretched. What is that supposed to be? She demanded. Because whatever he printed does not override HOA authority. I could feel the shift before she could. The officer's partner leaned in, reading over his shoulder, both of them now focused on the same set of documents. Legal language, recorded filings, county stamps, the kind of details that do not argue. The first officer looked back up at me, this time not with suspicion, but with something closer to careful attention. You said you live here, he continued, slower now. According to this, he paused again, choosing his words. You own multiple properties on this street. Margaret let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh, but it did not land the same way it had earlier. That is not possible, she snapped. Every homeowner here is part of the association. We manage the entire block. I tilted my head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes again. You manage the appearance, I said, not the ownership. The officer flipped one more page, his thumb stopping at a section highlighted in clean, deliberate lines. I remembered marking that part myself, anticipating this exact moment. These addresses, he said, reading them out quietly. They match several homes in this subdivision. His partner nodded, already connecting the dots. And the leasing agreements, he added, almost to himself. The word hung there. Leasing. It landed differently this time. Margaret's expression tightened, the certainty in her stance cracking just enough to notice. Those homeowners bought their houses, she insisted, voice rising again. But now there was something underneath it, something less controlled. They are not renting anything. I let the silence sit for a second, long enough for the weight of the documents to do their work. Long enough for the officers to finish reading without interruption. The night air felt cooler now, sharper, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. They bought structures, I said finally, calm, even. But the land. Underneath those structures was part of a separate holding agreement. The officer's eyes flicked back to the page, confirming it. Which you acquired, he said, finishing the thought out loud. I gave a small nod. Earlier this year. Margaret shook her head, stepping back like the ground itself had shifted. No, she said quickly. No, that would have gone through the board. We would have been notified. I almost smiled at that. Almost. That is the thing about private transactions, I replied. They do not require HOA approval. The officer closed the folder halfway, not all the way, just enough to signal he had seen what he needed. His posture had changed completely now, shoulders squared in a different direction, attention no longer centered on me as a problem, but on the situation as a whole. Margaret noticed it too. I could see it in the way her hands tightened around that clipboard, the edges digging into her fingers. For the first time since she stepped onto my driveway, she did not look in control, and we were still only at the beginning. Margaret's voice came back sharper this time, but it did not carry the same weight it had a few minutes ago, like a speaker turned up too loud trying to hide the static underneath. That is not how property works, she said, stepping forward again, forcing confidence back into her posture. You cannot just buy land under occupied homes without notifying the association. There are procedures. The officer did not respond to her right away. Instead, he reopened the folder slightly, scanning a section near the bottom, his finger tracing along a stamped line that caught the porch light. I recognized that page instantly. County record seal, filing date, transfer confirmation, the kind of documentation that does not care about opinions. Ma'am, he said finally, calm but firm. This appears to be a legally recorded transaction through the county. It does not require HOA approval. The words landed heavier than anything I had said. You could feel it. Margaret blinked, just once, but it was enough. The air shifted again. A car slowed at the end of the street, headlights sweeping across us before continuing on, like even strangers could sense something unfolding here. No, she said again, quieter now, but more urgent. No, that is not possible. We would have been notified. There are bylaws. There are protections. I let out a slow breath, not tired, not frustrated, just measured. Your bylaws govern homeowners within your association, I said. They do not override county property law. The second officer straightened slightly, nodding almost imperceptibly as he processed it. So if he owns the land, he said, more to his partner than anyone else, that changes the situation. Changes the situation. That was one way to put it. Margaret's grip on the clipboard tightened again, the edges pressing into her palm hard enough that I could see the tension in her fingers. This is absurd, she snapped, trying to regain ground. Even if that were true, these residents have rights. They cannot just be displaced because of some paperwork maneuver. There it was. The first crack of reality breaking through her control. Not denial anymore. Concern. I nodded slightly. They do have rights, I agreed. Which is why everything is governed by the lease agreements tied to those parcels. The officer's eyes flicked back down to the folder, flipping another page. And these leases, he said, scanning, they are valid and active. He looked up at me again, this time with a completely different tone. Which makes you. He did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Margaret did. Her face went still for a second, like her mind was catching up to something she had not even considered before tonight. No, she said again, but this time it came out quieter, almost under her breath. No, that does not make sense. I met her gaze, steady, unshaken. It does, I said. You just never had a reason to check. The sprinkler system clicked off somewhere down the block, leaving the street in a deeper silence than before. No background noise. No distraction. Just the weight of what was now sitting between all of us. The officer closed the folder gently this time, not dismissively, but with intention. His posture had shifted completely away from enforcement and into something more procedural, more careful. Ma'am, he said, turning toward Margaret. At this point, there does not appear to be any trespassing issue. That sentence changed everything. I could see it hit her. Not all at once, but enough. The certainty she walked in with was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar, unstable, and for the first time since she pointed at me from the street, she did not have the upper hand. Not even close. Margaret opened her mouth like she was about to argue again, but nothing came out at first, just a tight breath that caught halfway, like her brain was still trying to rewrite the situation into something she could control. The street felt different now, quieter in a way that made every small sound sharper, the faint buzz of a porch light, the distant hum of a car turning onto the main road, even the soft shift of the officer's boots on the concrete. This is not over, she said finally, forcing the words out, her voice steadier than she probably felt. Even if you bought land, that does not give you authority over residents. We have contracts. We have structure. This community does not just fall apart because you show up with paperwork. I nodded slightly, not dismissing her, just letting her speak, because this part mattered. The more she talked, the clearer everything became. You are right, I said, calm, measured. Communities do not fall apart because of paperwork. I paused just long enough for her to lean into that, for her shoulders to square again, for that familiar confidence to start rebuilding itself. Then I continued. They fall apart when people assume authority they never legally had. The officer beside me shifted his stance again, this time fully turning toward Margaret, not me. That detail did not go unnoticed. Ma'am, he said carefully, If the land ownership is as described here, then any residency disputes would be civil matters tied to lease agreements, not HOA enforcement. Civil matters. Lease agreements. Words that carried weight, but not the kind she was used to controlling. Margaret shook her head quickly, her grip loosening slightly on the clipboard before tightening again. You do not understand, she insisted, her voice rising. Just a fraction. We enforce standards here. We maintain property values. Without the HOA, this place would turn into chaos. I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Not amused, not irritated, just steady. Standards do not come from authority you claim, I said. They come from authority you actually have. The officer holding the folder opened it again, flipping back to the section with the lease agreements, his eyes moving more carefully now, slower, like each line mattered more than it did a few minutes ago. These agreements, he said, pointing slightly, they outline occupancy conditions tied directly to the landowner. He looked up at me again, no hesitation this time. Which is you? That was the moment it fully landed. Not just with him, with her. I watched it happen in real time. The shift behind her eyes, the realization threading its way through everything she thought she controlled. No, she said again. But this time it was quieter, thinner, like the word itself did not have the strength it used to. No, that does not give you the right to interfere with the HOA. I tilted my head slightly. I am not interfering, I said. I am operating within my rights. The night air felt still again, but heavier now, like something had settled into place that could not be moved back. The officer closed the folder once more, this time holding it with both hands, respectful, deliberate. Ma'am, he said, more firmly now, there is no basis for a police matter here. If there are disagreements, they will need to be handled through proper legal channels. Margaret stood there for a second, completely still, the streetlight catching the edge of her face, highlighting something new, something unfamiliar. Not authority, not control, something closer to uncertainty. And for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she did not have an immediate move left to make. The officers stepped back from the doorway almost in sync, not rushed, not uncomfortable, just done with what they had been called here to handle. And that alone said more than anything else could have. The one holding the folder extended it back toward me, careful, respectful now, like he understood exactly what he was handing back. You might want to keep these accessible, he said, his tone steady but different, more aligned with mine than hers. I took the folder without a word, feeling the familiar weight settle back into my hands, the edges still crisp, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded around it. Margaret did not move. Not at first. She stood there under the streetlight, her shadow stretching across the pavement, the clipboard hanging loosely at her side now, instead of pressed tightly against her chest. That was new. The officer glanced at her one last time. Ma'am, we are going to clear out, he said. There is no enforcement action needed here tonight. No enforcement. No authority. Just reality. The sound of their boots on the walkway was soft but final as they turned and headed back toward the patrol car, doors opening with a muted click before closing again. The engine started, headlights cutting across the front of the house, before pulling away down the street, the red and blue lights disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. And just like that, the noise was gone. No sirens. No voices. Just the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling back into itself. Margaret exhaled slowly, like she had been holding her breath longer than she realized. Then she looked at me again, really looked this time, not as a problem to fix, but as something she had completely misread. This is not how this ends, she said, her voice lower now, stripped of that performative edge. You think a few documents change how this community operates? I tilted my head slightly, the folder resting casually against my side. They already have, I replied. She shook her head immediately, but there was hesitation now, visible, undeniable. We have bylaws. Enforcement procedures. You cannot just override that because you found a loophole. Loophole. That word almost made me smile. It is not a loophole, I said calmly. It is ownership. The word landed clean. No room to twist it. No room to argue around it. The breeze picked up just slightly, rustling the trees along the curb, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass through the air. Normal neighborhood details. The kind she built her authority around. But tonight, they felt different. Less controlled. Less certain. Margaret straightened her posture again, trying to rebuild what had slipped, but it did not come back the same way. "We will review this," she said, more to herself than to me. "The board will look at every detail. If there is any violation, any inconsistency, we will act." I nodded once. "You should," I said. "I already did." That stopped her, just for a second, but it was enough. The silence stretched again, heavier than before, not because something might happen, but because something already had. I shifted the folder slightly in my hand, then added, almost casually, "And while you are reviewing everything, you might want to pay close attention to the lease terms tied to each property." Her eyes narrowed, not in anger this time, but in calculation. "Why would that matter?" she asked. I held her gaze, steady, controlled. "Because those terms define who actually has the authority to decide who stays here." The wind moved through the street again, soft but noticeable, and for the first time since she knocked on my door, Margaret did not interrupt, did not argue, did not assert control. She just stood there, processing, realizing that whatever came next was no longer something she could command into existence. It was something she would have to face. Margaret did not say anything for a long second, and that silence told me more than any argument she could have made, because people like her always filled silence with control, and now she had none. The streetlight above her flickered once, a soft electrical hum trailing behind it, and I could see the shift happening in real time. The way her posture adjusted, the way her eyes moved not with certainty anymore, but with calculation. "Lease terms," she repeated quietly, like she was testing the words, trying to find a way around them. "That does not change HOA governance." I let out a slow breath, not impatient, just steady. "It changes everything about who has the final say," I replied. The air felt cooler now, the kind of night where the temperature drops just enough to make you aware of it, like the environment itself was resetting around us. Margaret glanced down at her clipboard for the first time since this started, flipping through pages quickly, scanning rules, sections, anything she could grab onto. Paper against paper, fast, sharp, almost desperate. "There are compliance standards," she said, more to the pages than to me. "There are residency requirements, violations, enforcement authority." I watched her, calm, unmoving. "And all of those apply to homeowners under your association," I said. "Not to the landowner who holds the underlying property rights." That stopped her again. Not fully, but enough to break the rhythm she was trying to rebuild. She looked back up at me, eyes sharper now, searching. "You are saying you can just override the board?" she asked. I shook my head once. "I am saying the board never had authority over this layer of ownership to begin with." The words settled heavier than anything before them. No raised voice, no emphasis, just fact. A porch light down the street clicked on, casting a warm glow across one of the neighboring houses, and for a second I could see curtains shift, silhouettes behind windows. People were watching now. They always did when control started slipping. Margaret noticed it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened again, not from confidence, but from awareness. This was no longer private. This was visible. "Even if that were true," she said, trying to regain ground, "these residents have agreements with the HOA. They follow our rules." I nodded slightly. "They follow your rules as homeowners," I said. "But their right to occupy the land is tied to something else." Her eyes narrowed. "Which is?" she asked. I adjusted the folder in my hand, not opening it, not needing to. "The lease agreements," I said. "The ones that define occupancy, compliance, and renewal conditions." The breeze picked up again, carrying the faint scent of someone grilling somewhere down the block, a normal detail that felt almost out of place in the middle of everything else. Margaret swallowed, subtle but visible, and for the first time since this started, she did not immediately respond. She was thinking now, really thinking, not reacting, not controlling, processing. "You are implying," she began, but stopped herself before finishing the sentence. I held her gaze, steady, giving her just enough space to connect the rest on her own. Because that was the point. Not to tell her, to let her realize it. Her fingers tightened slightly around the clipboard again, but not with the same force as before. This time it looked more like she was holding on to something that no longer felt solid. "Those agreements," she said slowly, carefully now, "they include compliance conditions?" I nodded once. "They do." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. Heavier. Final in a way that did not need to be explained. Margaret looked past me for a second, toward the row of houses behind, the ones she had spent years controlling, managing, shaping. Then she looked back at me, and this time, there was no trace of the smile she walked in with. Only the realization that the rules she built her power on were not the ones that actually mattered anymore. Margaret's lips parted slightly, like she was about to argue again, but the words never came, because this time she already knew where it would lead. The street had gone completely still, no cars, no distant noise, just that quiet suburban silence that suddenly felt heavier than anything else. I shifted my weight slightly, the folder still resting against my side, and watched as she recalculated everything in front of me. Compliance conditions, she repeated again, slower now, each word measured like she was walking across something unstable. You are saying their right to stay here depends on your approval. I did not rush the answer, did not lean into it. Just let the truth sit where it was. It depends on whether the terms of their lease are being met, I said calmly. The distinction mattered, and she knew it. Her eyes narrowed again, but not with arrogance this time, with understanding. And those terms, she continued carefully, include adherence to property use standards. I gave a small nod. They include adherence to all applicable conditions tied to the land. The breeze moved through again, softer this time, carrying the faint creak of a loose mailbox hinge somewhere down the street. Small details, background noise, but everything felt sharper now, like the entire neighborhood was listening without making a sound. Margaret looked down at her clipboard again, flipping pages slower this time, not searching, just stalling. The board enforces standards, she said, but the sentence sounded weaker now, like it no longer anchored anything. The board enforces what it has authority over, I replied. Nothing more. That landed exactly where it needed to. I could see it in her face, the moment she connected the final piece. The HOA controlled appearances, guidelines, surface-level compliance. But the actual right to occupy the land, to remain in those homes, to continue living inside that perfectly maintained neighborhood that belonged somewhere else now. It belonged to me. She looked up at me again, and this time there was no attempt to mask it. No polished tone, no practice control, just clarity. If someone violates those lease terms, she said slowly, you can take action. I held her gaze, steady, unshaken. Legally, I said. Yes. The word echoed in the space between us, quiet but absolute. A porch light flicked off down the street, and for a second the shadows shifted across the pavement, stretching longer, darker. Margaret swallowed again, more noticeable this time, and glanced briefly toward the houses behind her. The same houses she had spent years managing, controlling, enforcing. But now she was seeing them differently. Not as assets under her authority, as properties tied to agreements she never controlled. You would not, she started, but stopped, like even saying it out loud made it real. I did not interrupt. I did not need to. She already understood. Her grip on the clipboard loosened slightly, the edges no longer digging into her hand. This community depends on stability, she said, but it sounded more like a realization than an argument. People follow the rules because they believe the system holds. I nodded once. Systems only hold when they are built on the right foundation, I said. The silence that followed was not tense anymore. It was settled, final in a way that did not need volume. Margaret stood there for a long second, looking at me, then past me, then back again, like she was seeing everything from a different angle now. And for the first time since this started, she did not try to assert control, did not raise her voice, did not push back. Because she had already reached the same conclusion I had known from the beginning. The authority she thought she had was never the authority that actually mattered. Margaret stood there a moment longer, the weight of everything settling in around her like the night air itself had thickened, and I could see it clearly now, not just the loss of control, but the realization that control had never actually been hers to begin with. The clipboard in her hand lowered slowly, almost unconsciously, until it rested against her side, no longer a shield, no longer a symbol of authority, just paper. So what happens now? She asked, and for the first time since she knocked on my door, her voice was not commanding anything. It was asking. I shifted the folder slightly, the edges catching the porch light again, the same documents that had quietly rewritten everything without raising their voice once. That depends, I said calmly, on how your board chooses to move forward. She let out a slow breath, looking past me again toward the row of houses, each one identical in structure, perfectly maintained lawns, matching fences, the kind of neighborhood built to look controlled from every angle. But now she saw the difference. The surface and the foundation were not the same thing. If there are violations, she said carefully, if homeowners have been acting outside of your lease terms. Her words trailed off, but she did not need to finish. I nodded once. Then those agreements get reviewed, I said, and enforced. The word hung there, heavier than anything she had said earlier about HOA rules or compliance standards, because this time it came from something real. Not assumed authority, actual authority. The wind moved softly down the street again, carrying the distant sound of a garage door closing somewhere far off, normal life continuing like nothing had changed, even though everything had. Margaret looked back at me, and there was something different in her expression now, not defeat, not anger, just clarity. You are not trying to join the HOA, she said. It was not a question. I shook my head slightly. No, I replied. I am not. Another pause. Not tense. Just final. She nodded once, small, almost automatic, like her mind had already moved ahead to what came next. The board will need to review all of this immediately, she said, more composed now, but without that edge she walked in with. We will need to notify residents, re-evaluate agreements. This, she stopped, searching for the right word. This changes things. I almost smiled, but I did not. It clarifies things, I said. That was the difference. She understood that too. The streetlight above us hummed softly, steady now, no flicker, no instability, just a constant glow over a situation that had finally settled into truth. Margaret adjusted her grip on the clipboard, not tightening it this time, just holding it, like she was aware of what it actually was now. Not power, just paper. We will be in contact, she said, turning slightly, already preparing to leave, but slower than before, more deliberate. I gave a small nod. I expect you will, I said. She paused for just a fraction of a second, then continued down the walkway, her steps quieter now, less certain, the sound of her heels fading into the distance as she moved back toward the street. I watched her go, the same person who had stood there earlier pointing, commanding, calling in authority she believed she controlled, and now walking away, carrying something very different. Understanding. The neighborhood settled back into silence around me, calm, ordinary, unchanged on the surface, but underneath it, everything had shifted. I turned slightly, the folder still in my hand, and glanced once more down the street, rows of houses sitting quietly under the night sky. They thought they controlled who belonged here. Turns out, that decision was never theirs to make.